At 7:45 a.m., a scream burst from the main office and fractured the corridor hush. Fluorescents throbbed, lockers rattled, and Ava froze with a paper trembling in her hand. Marco said, "You can't fire me after 20 years, and his voice struck the glass. A stapler skidded, a student gasped, and the hallway tilted on its axis. Ava said, "Hey, breathe," though her own breath clipped short like torn ribbon. Marco shouted, "Tell your boss Calder I know what he did," and the name rang with iron weight. The word dropped through Ava, finding an old bruise she had learned to ignore. Coffee leaked across cracked linoleum, sketching brown rivers between the tiles. A security guard eased forward, palms open, weight low, radio cord swaying in a slow arc. A folder slid from a shelf, its pages fanning like startled birds mid-flight. A crest flashed on letterhead, Calder Foundation, its wax seal bruised blue. Ava stared, and memory unlatched a drawer she had not touched since childhood. She recalled a winter night, a vanished key, and voices buried under snow. The girl behind her whispered, "Is he okay?" and silence answered them both. The fluorescent hum thickened into a wire drawn too tight across the air. Ava's fingers shook once, steadied, and then shook again, betraying the quake inside. The corridor exhaled, yet the echo clung to Ava's ribs like damp cloth. She crouched to gather the scattered papers, and the crest watched her from the page like a quiet eye. A memory flickered of a wooden drawer, and a key that vanished on a winter night. Ava said, "It's just a name," though she knew it was never just a name with teeth like that. The paper edges rasped against her fingers, leaving tiny ridges like braille for the past. The ink bled the same navy she once saw on an envelope she was told to forget. Marco's fury softened behind the door, a thunderhead moving off the coast. The guard murmured weather talk calm, and the ordinary words felt merciful. Ava slid the papers back, but one letter clung to her palm as if magnetic. It carried a date that pressed a thumb on her breath and would not lift. She read the header again, tracing Calder Foundation with the edge of a nail. The corridor clock clicked, the second hand snagged on a scratch, then leaped ahead. A draft moved along the baseboards, smelling of wet wool and old dust. Ava tucked the letter near her heart and rose, steadier than she felt inside. Somewhere a door latched, and silence gathered itself around the name like armor. She checked the date and felt time fold like a page bent to mark a hurt. The letter referenced a grant that arrived the same year her father disappeared. Ava said, "No," and the syllable hit the tile and rolled away without echo. She stood and scanned the office window, catching a framed photo like a fishhook. The deputy mayor shook hands with the principal, and a brass plaque read Calder beneath them. Marco muttered through the wall he knew, and the phrase scored a new line on old maps. Ava remembered a car door closing, a promise to be home by dinner, and a silence that bred winters. The photo shone hard, reflecting the corridor lights like a shield against questions. Her pulse drummed the name until it became the metronome of the hall. She tasted copper as if a coin melted under her tongue and stained her resolve. "If this is the thread, I follow it," she thought, and the thought steadied her feet. She stepped toward the office door, drawn as if by tide, not by choice or comfort. The glass fogged, cleared, and fogged again with her breath and the hum of the lights. Behind her, a locker latch clicked twice, impatient with the past. Ava set her shoulder to the present and moved. Principal Harris stepped into view with a practiced smile that faltered at the corners. Principal Harris said, "Everything is under control," and the words slid across the floor like oil. Ava nodded, but her gaze snagged on the plaque again as if it whispered. The guard guided Marco down the hall, and the man's anger folded into a smaller grief. Marco said, "He took everything," and the sentence sagged under more than one story. Ava said, "Who is your boss?" and Harris blinked as if the question carried heat. His eyes flicked to the photo by reflex, and that small glance lit every fuse in her chest. The fluorescent sang a tight wire note that vibrated through seams and vents. A student darted past with a late pass, and paper wind chased her shoes. Harris said, "Ms. Reyes, Please let us handle this. But the plea sounded thin. Ava's shoulders squared as if someone had placed a cloak on her back. The crest on the letter peered from her notebook edge like a witness. She measured the distance between truth and policy, and found it shrinking. Somewhere a bell rang, wrong and late, and the day lurched forward anyway. The hall thinned as students poured into rooms, leaving the air raw and ringing. Ava touched the plaque frame and felt a light tremor rise from the varnished wood. She saw the ghost of her father's handwriting in the loops of the engraved letters. Ava said, "If this is you, I will find you." And the vow tasted like metal and rain. Harris said, "Ms. Reyes, class is waiting," but his voice skimmed like a stone. She slid the letter into her notebook, not stealing, only keeping what already belonged. The rain outside eased, polishing the windows to a flat silver that cooled her pulse. The clock's second hand snagged, then leaped again, impatient for a reckoning. Her shoes squeaked once as she turned, and the sound felt like a gavel in miniature. She pictured a road unrolling from this door to rooms she had avoided for years. Thought steadied her steps and spread heat through her fingers and jaw. No more drawers locked, she decided, and the words fit like a key. The corridor smelled of paper, wool, and resolve, a new blend she could name. Ava walked toward her classroom with a gravity she had been earning a long time. First period crept in with wet shoes and yawns, and Ava set out dry worksheets like small rafts. A boy with a torn backpack covered, and the zipper's teeth gaped like a wound. Ava said, "Jamal, give me 5 minutes and a paperclip," and hope flickered. Jamal said, "Miss Reyes, you always fix things," and the room warmed by a notch. She knelt, mended the strap, and steadied a day that wanted to tilt. The clock clicked like distant rain on tin, and chalk dust rose in a tired halo. Ava said, "You're not your mistakes," and the sentence landed where it needed to. A girl whispered about a test and a hungry morning, and Ava slid a granola bar. She did it without ceremony, because kindness works best when it is ordinary. The letter in her notebook pressed a cool square against her ribs, and waited. Ava breathed, counted the eyes before her, and chose the present over the ache. The staff room smelled of burnt coffee and old victories, and the vending machines sighed. Ava dialed a shelter between bells, thumb pressed white to the phone's edge. Ava said, "This is Ava Reyes. I have a student who needs a safe bed tonight," steady and soft. A counselor on the line said, "We can hold one if a guardian signs," and the hinge squeaked. Ava said, "I will walk them through it," and wrote names in careful ink. Principal Harris drifted in and nodded, and worry fluttered behind his eyes. He said, "Thank you for staying on top of this," and left before the silence grew teeth. Ava folded a note for the student and taped a gentle map to the inside. A text from Lena blinked. "Are you okay?" But she slid the screen face down. The letter in her notebook pulsed like a lighthouse she was not ready to sail toward. Was done. She poured fresh coffee, and Mercy filled the cup before the liquid did. Evening folded the city into soft rectangles, and Ava unlocked her small apartment. A plant leaned toward the window, thin but stubborn, and a kettle hummed like a lullaby. Her mother, Elena, said, "You work too hard," from the couch with a quilt at her knees. Elena, 58 years old, watched the steam rise and did not meet the questions in the air. Ava said, "Did Dad ever talk about grants or the Calder name?" And the room tightened. Elena said, "He talked about coming home early," and the sentence set a plate for grief. The kettle clicked, and the silence poured itself into 2 chipped cups. Ava added honey to buy time and courage, then let the spoon ring once. Elena said, "You have always made yourself useful," which was love and apology together. Ava said, "Useful is not the same as whole," and the truth tasted like metal. They drank, and the city hummed, and the letter waited inside the notebook like weather. After dinner, Ava walked to the community center where the floor smelled of bleach and hope. She ran a reading circle, and children ringed her like campfire sparks. Ava said, "Your voice matters here," and a shy girl tried a brave sentence. The words stumbled, then found a rhythm and a place to land. Lena arrived with a crate of donated books and a grin that hid worry. Lena, 33 years old, said, "You never stop," and set the crate down like an anchor. Ava said, "Someone once held a door for me and opened another for the kid beside her." The fluorescent buzz softened, as if the ceiling believed in gentleness. Lena said, "Text me if you need anything," and the offer hung steady above the noise. Ava nodded, and gratitude moved through her like a tide that cleans rather than erases. The circle closed with claps, and the night air felt larger than the room. Near midnight, Ava cleared a small desk and opened the notebook to the letter. The navy crest glinted like a night star that insisted on being named. Ta. She copied the date into her planner, as if order could tame the ache. Ava said, "Tomorrow, I ask better questions," and felt the sentence steady her spine. The room ticked, and the radiator breathed, and the city stitched itself to sleep. She taped a sticky note to her door that read, "Call shelter, call Jamal's mom, call records." Every call served someone else, and one call would serve the girl she used to be. Lena's text blinked again, "You sure you're okay?" And Ava typed, "I will be," then paused. She added, "Thank you, because gratitude is a bridge that holds under any weather." She set a pen across the envelope like a compass needle finding north. The hush thickened into comfort, and she let the night keep watch with her name. The municipal records office smelled of toner and raincoats, and the fluorescents hummed like a hive. Ava slid a request form under the glass and kept her voice level. Ava said, "Community grants, fiscal year of my father's disappearance." The clerk frowned at the date and wheeled away in a chair that sighed. The catalog returned with a thump, and columns marched like soldiers across the page. A line item gleamed where it should have whispered. It read, "Calder Foundation, pilot funding, with a consultant called Northbridge Civic." Ava said, "Print that," and the printer coughed out proof like smoke. The clerk said, "There's an internal memo attached," and slid a thin page forward. The memo bore a signature she knew as surely as her own breath. It read, "Mateo Reyes, concerns noted, request for audit denied." Ava's pulse stepped into a faster street and refused to slow. The clerk said, "Are you okay?" And she nodded because words would spill if she used them. Outside, tires hissed on wet pavement, as if the city stayed quiet for this page. Ava folded the copy and felt history sharpen its teeth. Marco chose a diner where the coffee punished, and the neon forgave. He sat in a corner booth with a bandaged knuckle and a silence that tried to be brave. Marco said, "I was fired because I asked for receipts," and he pushed a thumb drive across Formica. Ava said, "What am I about to see?" and the neon flickered like a warning. Marco said, "Payments to Northbridge for services no one can name," and the word services bent. A waitress topped off their cups as if secrecy needed caffeine. Marco said, "Your father came to me once with a box and a deadline," and his eyes clouded. He added, "He said if anything happened, follow the money and the man who smiles too hard." Ava said, "Calder," and the name made the spoon ring against porcelain. Outside, buses smeared light into patient lines. Marco said, "Be careful," and slid a folded card with a reporter's number. The booze vinyl creaked like an old truth turning over. Ava pocketed the drive and felt its small weight bully her breath into purpose. The reporter lived in a garage that smelled of ink, citrus cleaner, and old thunder. Gus Patel said, "I chased Calder's shadows for a year," and he lifted a banker's box. Gus, 66 years old, wore a sweater with elbows that had learned patience. He pinned a document to cork and tapped a logo that tried to look honest. Gus said, "Northbridge is a shell that invoices the city, then bleeds into a donor pool." Ava said, "My father filed an audit request," and her voice carried a steadiness she borrowed. Gus said, "He was scheduled to testify before the budget committee, then vanished." Photos of smiling officials stared from the wall like portraits of weather. Gus said, "Editors killed my story when the foundation announced a scholarship drive." Ava said, "What proof survives?" and the question stood up straighter than she did. Gus opened a folder labeled Backups and offered 3 faded CDs, and a list of names. He said, "If you knock on doors, knock fast," and he underlined a name twice. The name read Ruth Hale, Chief of Staff, and the ink looked very awake. Night wrapped City Hall in wet stone and good intentions. Ava signed in for the public records window, then walked past it with a calm built from practice. A basement door sighed open, and the stairwell counted her steps like a metronome. She found Records B, a room that believed in dust more than visitors. File boxes slept in rows that dreamed of labels and silence. Ava said, "Ruth Hale," to the dark, and pulled a carton with a date that hurt. Inside lay memos stapled to contracts with signatures that leaned away from truth. A photocopy showed Northbridge invoices funneled through a school improvement fund. A second showed a denial stamped over Mateo Reyes with ink that refused to fade. Footsteps scratched the hall, and Ava slipped her phone light off, and her breath small. A guard paused at the door, and then kept walking, mercy disguised as routine. Ava scanned, saved, and slid papers back in the order she found them. The stairwell welcomed her with a draft that felt like a blessing earned the hard way. The apartment held its breath when Ava unlocked the door past midnight. Elena looked up from a book she was not reading and set it down like a shield. Ava said, "He filed an audit and was blocked by Calder's people," and the room narrowed. Elena said, "Your father promised to be careful," and her mouth folded around the promise. Ava said, "Did he know Ruth Hale?" and the name tasted like rust. Elena said, "He knew everyone when he was trying to save the program," and her eyes found the window. She added, "He mentored a teenager who helped after school and borrowed our tools." Ava said a name, and the request felt like stepping onto thin ice. Elena said Thomas, and the syllables opened a door Ava had not seen. She added, "He was Lena's older brother," and shame crossed the room without asking. Elena said, "We were all trying to help," and her hands folded a tissue into a small boat. Ava nodded because the tide had turned, and she needed her balance. Outside, the rain slowed to a thread, and the night listened with her. The community center echoed with rain and mop water. Ava said, "I need the truth about Thomas." Lena's smile slipped. Lena said, "He helped your father copy files, then panicked." Ava said, "You knew and told me nothing." The exit sign buzzed. Lena said, "Ruth Hale called and warned me to stay quiet." She added, "They threatened Thomas." Ava's jaw set like a doorframe. Ava said, "Show me what you kept." The space between them shrank to a blade. Lena nodded, small and shaking. In the supply closet, bleach stung the air. Lena peeled tape from a metal box. Lena said, "Thomas gave me this the week your father vanished." Ava said, "Open it." Inside lay a keycard, a note signed M. Reyes and Northbridge invoices. The note named Ruth Hale, and a vote. Ava said, "You buried my map." Lena said, "The assistant was a trap." Ava photographed every page and steadied her breath. Rain hammered Lena's sedan while the heater sighed. Ava said, "How long did you keep this from me?" Lena said, "Since the scholarship gala." She added, "Ruth paid me and pushed an NDA. My mother needed chemo." Ava said, "You chose them over my father." Lena said, "I chose survival and planned to fix it." Neon smeared across the glass. Ava said, "You knew I would chase this." Lena said, "I did," and grief fogged the window. The storage yard glowed in sodium haze. Unit 17B rattled up. A banker's box wore Calder Foundation tape like a dare. Ava said, hiding in plain sight. Inside, Mateo's notebook named her. The page read, "If I do not return, give this to Ava." She traced a loop from Northbridge to a donor fund to a PAC. Lena's phone vibrated. The screen showed Ruth Hale calling, bright as a flare. Speakerphone flattened the night. Ruth Hale said, "Deliver the package at 10 and be remembered kindly." Ava said, "This is Ava Reyes." Silence tightened. Ruth said, "Your father mistook process for courage." Ava said, "He mistook you for accountable." Ruth said, Walk away, or you will orphan your future. Lena ended the call with shaking hands. Ava pressed record. Ava said, "Start at the beginning." The dark felt closer to morning. Dawn stained the windows pale as Ava spread documents across her table like a map of storms. Gus said, "Committee meets at 10, public comment at the end." Lena said, "We can slip in as volunteers," and held 2 lanyards. Marco said, "I will swear under oath that invoices were fake." Elena poured coffee and set a hand on Ava's shoulder as if bracing a mast. Elena said, "Tell the truth and let it cost what it costs." Ava weighed the phone with Ruth's threat like a stone that still floated. She heard students' laughter in her memory and chose who she wanted to be. Ava said, "We go together, and the drive goes live when I speak." Gus said, "I cued the story, 1 click, and his cursor hovered." Lena said, "If they come for me, they come through me," and her voice stopped shaking. Ava gathered the pages and felt fear fall into formation behind purpose. The clock clicked calmer than she was, and the morning opened its gate. City Hall steps gleamed with rain, and cameras blinked like cautious insects. Protesters held signs that said, "Where did the money go?" and the wind read them aloud. Gus said, "We publish if they shut you down," and slipped into the press line. Ava said, "I speak first as a teacher, then as Mateo's daughter," and her pulse steadied. Lena adjusted her hood and scanned the doors like a sentry who grew up overnight. Marco said, "HR warned me to stay away," and he stayed anyway. A guard eyed their badges and waved them through after a pause that weighed them. The rotunda smelled of marble, wet coats, and promises. Ruth Hale stood near a column with an umbrella like a black thought. Ruth said, "Turn around, Ms. Reyes," and the courtesy cut like glass. Ava said, "I am going in," and the door's brass handle answered with a cold shine. The budget chamber glowed with oak and microphones that remembered lies. Counselors shuffled notes while a clock watched them from high wood. The chair said, "Public comment begins," and the room tilted toward the podium. Ava said, "My name is Ava Reyes, teacher, and I have documents concerning Northbridge Civic." A murmur rose as she held up invoices and a memo stamped "denied" over Mateo's request. Ava said, "Funds left a school account, entered a donor pool, and returned as political spend." Ruth said, "Objection to defamatory hearsay," and did not meet her eyes. Ava said, "I have city records, a keycard log, and a witness," and Marco stood. Marco said, "I was fired after asking for receipts," and his voice did not break this time. Gus tapped send and phones in the dais flickered like startled fish. The room inhaled and forgot to exhale for one long beat. Ruth advanced with a smile that filed teeth smooth. Ruth said, "This is a misunderstanding by a distressed employee and a grieving child." Ava said, "I am an educator used to audits, rubrics, and proof," and placed Mateo's notebook. She read, "If I do not return, give this to Ava," and the ink reached the back row. Principal Harris stepped forward with a throat clear that sounded like apology. Harris said, "The Foundation's grant cycle bypassed oversight," and his eyes found the brass clock. A counselor said, "Ms. Hale, did you approve Northbridge as vendor and donor both?" Ruth said, "Our attorneys will answer," and her umbrella leaned against the wall like a threat. Ava said, "Mateo requested an audit and was denied by your office," and the seal on the memo shone. The chair said, "Clerk, mark the exhibits," and the room shifted from theater to record. Security parted for a man whose smile had built buildings. Calder said, "The city thrives on partnerships," and the cameras turned as if trained. Ava said, "The city bleeds when partnerships are circular," and projected the looped flow. Numbers marched across the screen like boots that finally admitted where they were headed. Elena watched from the gallery and folded her hands as if steadying the ship. Calder said, "You risk your position and your school for noise," and his tone softened to pity. Ava said, "My students deserve quiet halls built with honest brick," and her voice carried. Phones chimed with Gus's story and a live feed of documents that would not vanish. The chair said, "This matter is referred to the Inspector General," and gavels found wood. Calder's smile cooled, and Ruth's pen paused mid-note. Ava exhaled, felt fear release its grip, and chose the risk with both hands open. The chamber emptied into a storm of microphones and damp suits. Gus said, "The story is live," and phones chimed like distant gulls. An investigator said, "Miss Reyes, we will need originals," and flashed a badge. Marco said, "I can swear to the invoices," and his jaw finally relaxed. Elena hugged Ava and whispered, "Breathe now," as if permission mattered. Reporters shouted for a quote, but Ava shook her head and chose the stairs. Ruth watched from a column's shadow with a smile that forgot to reach her eyes. Calder spoke to cameras about partnerships and patience and due process. Ava said, "My students have a quiz after lunch," and the decision steadied her. Harris texted, "We will cover your class," but she kept walking toward work. Lena fell into step and said, "I'm with you," and let the rain clean her face. The rotunda smelled of marble and new air, and the door opened without argument. The classroom smelled of pencils and rain-dried coats when Ava stepped in. Jamal said, "Did you get them?" and Hope jumped before he could catch it. Ava said, "We got the truth moving," and passed back papers with calm hands. She wrote essential questions on the board as if the world obeyed grammar. Harris appeared in the doorway and said, "Miss Reyes, I'm sorry," with eyes that meant it. A girl asked, "Are we safe?" And Ava said, "You are my first." "Yes, every day." The room settled like a flock that trusted the field again. She taught transitions and evidence, as if each sentence could carry weight. Her phone buzzed with headlines, but she turned it face down and kept teaching. At the bell she said, "You are more than this storm," and they believed her. The hall noise returned like weather that knows its place. Ava breathed, and the ache changed shape without leaving. Afternoon brought Ava to a conference room, lined with boxes and patient clocks. An investigator said, "Chain of custody," and slid evidence forms across the table. Ava said, "These are copies, originals are secured," and placed Mateo's notebook. A second agent said, "Subpoenas are drafted, accounts will freeze by evening." Gus said, 3 sources confirmed the shell transfers and tapped highlights with care. Lena said, "I will testify and accept what follows," and her hands stopped shaking. A monitor scrolled emails bearing Northbridge headers that tried to sound helpful. The lead agent said, "Miss Hale has been placed on leave pending review." He added, "Mr. Calder's office has recused from vendor selection." Ava signed her statement and felt ink become boundary and bridge at once. The agent said, "Thank you for choosing the long road," and meant the words. Outside, the rain thinned to a mist that did not know how to threaten. Dusk pulled them to the river where the city kept its quieter stories. Ava said, "You carried a secret that hurt us," and left space for reply. Lena said, "I was afraid, and I chose small," and the words did not hide. Ava said, "I forgive you, but trust will need steps and time," and it sounded true. Lena nodded and said, "I will show up even when it costs." A voicemail arrived from Thomas with a desert area code and a tired courage. Thomas said, "I'm ready to talk on record," and shame softened into use. They watched barges drag light across water that did not argue. Ava said, "We build forward," and Lena said, "We build wide," and both smiled small. The wind tasted like rain that had learned restraint. Street lamps clicked on one by one like patient agreements. The night opened a lane that felt earned, not granted. Night settled kindly on the community center as chairs gathered in neat arcs. Ava announced a new literacy fund in Mateo's name, and applause found its level. Elena said, "He would have loved the noise," and laughed through a soft ache. Jamal read a paragraph that landed clean, and pride moved like weather. Marco stacked, donated dictionaries as if rebuilding were a craft you could learn. Gus filmed a short thank you, and stayed behind the lens like a good witness. Lena said, "Board meets next week. I will speak first," and the promise held shape. Ava taped the scholarship flyer beside the door and thought of keys and doors. And she texted, "We did not finish, we began," and let the message rest. The plant by her apartment window would get repotted tomorrow, not later. She locked up, listened to the quiet, and felt the city shift toward better. The road ahead was long, but now it had signs and company. Morning came quiet, and the school breathed like a ship in a safe harbor. Ava wrote, "Evidence builds trust," and the room found its rhythm. Jamal said, "You did it," and hope sounded like a pencil tapping. Ava said, "We did it by telling the truth." And she meant every word. Headlines buzzed in pockets, but the lesson ran steadier than the news. Harris said, "The district thanked you for speaking," and his voice carried relief. Ava said, "Thank the students for asking better questions," and the class smiled. A guidance aide slipped a note that read, "Hearing scheduled, records preserved." Ava folded it and felt the day unclench by a notch. She moved through attendance like prayer, one name at a time. Outside, the rain had become light that stayed. Inside, calm studied the board and stayed with it. After last bell, Ava met Thomas at a small cafe that smelled like oranges and steam. Thomas said, "I ran when I should have stayed," and the cup rattled in its saucer. Ava said, "Running kept you alive, but it hurt me," and the truth cleared space. Thomas said, "I will testify, and I will bring the tools he lent me back." Lena said, "I am here to listen and not defend," and kept her eyes steady. Thomas said, "Ruth promised work if I played dumb," and shame softened his jaw. Ava said, "You owe yourself better," and the sentence did not waver. He slid a flashcard across, labeled logs, and the past loosened its knot. Lena said, "We will walk you in when it is time," and promise felt solid. Ava breathed and let anger step back to make room for care. Outside, buses sighed and waited like patient bridges. Inside, 3 people decided to be larger than their fear. At dusk, Ava and Elena carried flowers to the river that remembered everything. Elena said, "Your father loved this bend," and her smile carried rain and sun. Ava said, "He taught me to label my notes," and laughter surprised them both. Elena said, "He taught me to rest between fights," and they rested on the rail. They set the flowers adrift and watched them take the slow current. Ava said, "I am lighter today," and the words felt earned. Elena said, "You are also heavier with purpose," and pride warmed the air. A barge moved past like a steady thought that refused drama. Ava said, "Tomorrow I teach, and after school I testify again if needed." Elena said, "Tomorrow I cook, and after dinner we plan," and the future stood up. The river took their thanks and did not argue. Night kept the promise by lighting each lamp in order. The staff room felt new, though the microwave still lied about time. Marco said, "HR rescinded my termination pending review," and relief unclenched his face. Ava said, "You kept receipts when no one else would," and the thanks landed. Harris said, "We will audit every grant with outside eyes," and the vow sounded real. A secretary placed a box of pastries that tasted like a truce. Gus said, "I'll run a follow-up on reforms, not just scandal," and he clicked record. Lena said, "I joined the center board," and the room answered with soft applause. Ava said, "We build habits, not headlines," and she cut the pastry in halves. A student popped in with a permission slip and a smile that mattered most. The day felt ordinary on purpose, and the ordinary felt holy. Outside, the flag stirred and rested like a long breath done right. Evening found Ava on the pedestrian bridge, where the city opens like a book. She carried her notebook and nothing else heavy. Ava said, "I am not done. But I am not afraid," and the wind agreed. Cars whispered below like tame weather. She thought of students who would test their courage next. She thought of Mateo, who had left her a map with room to add roads. Her phone lit with messages that asked for help, and she smiled, yes. Lens flare skimmed the river, and the day closed its file without losing it. Ava said, "I walk forward," and her steps matched the sentence. Behind her was noise, and ahead of her was work, and both could coexist. The city did not change shape, but she did, and that was the lever she needed.